I broke into Area 51 to rescue a wounded alien, and what he revealed about the experiments shocked me. I never believed I would become the kind of person who crosses government fences in the dead of night, but the coordinates that burned themselves into my dreams left me no choice. For 3 consecutive nights, I woke at exactly the same moment. My mind flooded with numbers and images of a place I had never seen, a vast desert compound surrounded by mountains that looked like sleeping giants guarding an ancient secret. The pull was not mere curiosity. It was a calling that resonated in my bones, a frequency that hummed through my entire being until I could no longer distinguish between my own thoughts and the voice that whispered, "Come and bear witness." I sold everything I owned, packed a single bag, and drove through the Nevada desert as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and violet. When I finally stood before the razor-wire perimeter of Area 51, my hands trembling against the cold metal fence, I understood that some truths are not meant to be pursued. They pursue us. The moment I cut through that barrier, I felt the weight of destiny settle on my shoulders like a mantle I had been waiting my entire life to wear. I was not breaking in. I was answering a summons that had been calling to me since before I was born. What I discovered in those first moments of trespass shattered every assumption I had carried about reality, government secrecy, and the scope of human history. The facility above ground was merely a facade, a theater of misdirection for curious eyes and conspiracy theorists who thought they understood what secrets lay beneath the sand. As I navigated through shadows and silence, evading patrol routes that I somehow knew instinctively how to avoid, I found the entrance, a maintenance shaft that descended far deeper than any blueprint would ever reveal. The tunnel walls changed as I climbed downward, from modern concrete to carved stone that bore symbols I recognized from ancient Sumerian texts, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Sanskrit inscriptions I had seen only in books about forgotten civilizations. The air grew thick with an energy that made my skin tingle and my heart race, not from fear, but from recognition, as if my soul remembered this place from a time before my body existed. I descended for what felt like hours, my flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed to pulse with their own subtle luminescence. The deeper I went, the more I felt I was not infiltrating a military installation, but approaching a temple, a convergence point where heaven and earth had touched since the dawn of human consciousness. When I finally reached the bottom and stood before massive doors carved with spiraling galaxies and geometric patterns that seemed to move in my peripheral vision, I understood that Area 51 was not built on this location by accident. It was built to conceal something far older, far more sacred, and infinitely more dangerous to those who wish to keep humanity small and sleeping. The doors opened soundlessly at my touch, as if they had been waiting for me specifically, and what lay beyond stole the breath from my lungs and brought tears to my eyes without warning. The chamber stretched impossibly vast, a cathedral carved from living rock that glowed with veins of crystalline light running through the stone like the neural pathways of some planetary consciousness. Scientific equipment lined the walls, cold steel and flickering monitors that looked obscene in this sacred space, like scalpels laid out on an altar. But it was not the technology that dropped me to my knees. It was the being suspended in the center of the chamber, bound by cables and energy fields that crackled with violet electricity. He was taller than any human, his form both familiar and utterly alien, with skin that shimmered like mother of pearl and limbs that seemed too elegant, too purposeful for the brutal restraints that held him. His eyes found mine across that impossible distance, and in that moment of contact, every wall I had ever built around my heart, every doubt I had harbored about the universe's essential nature, every question I had asked in desperate prayers to a God I hoped was listening, all of it shattered. Those eyes held galaxies within them, depths of sorrow and compassion that no human face could contain. And when his voice entered my mind, not as sound but as pure knowing, pure communion, I heard the most heartbreaking plea I have ever encountered. Please help me, brother. They do not understand what they are destroying. I moved toward him without conscious decision, my feet carrying me forward as tears streamed down my face, and my entire body trembled with the recognition that this moment was the reason I had been born. The telepathic connection between us intensified with each step, and I could feel his pain radiating through the chamber, not just physical agony from the experiments and restraints, but a deeper suffering born from witnessing beauty tortured, from watching a species with infinite potential cage and brutalize what they should welcome and learn from. Around us, monitoring equipment beeped and whirred, recording data from a being whose very existence rewrote everything humanity thought it knew about consciousness, divinity, and our place in the cosmic family. I could sense the scientists would return soon, armed with their instruments of curiosity that had become instruments of cruelty, driven by fear and the hunger for weapons rather than wisdom. As I reached the base of the platform, where he hung suspended like a crucified angel, our eyes locked again, and the download began. Visions, memories, and revelations flooding into my consciousness with such intensity that I gasped and gripped the cold metal railing to keep from collapsing. In that sacred, terrible moment, I understood that I had not broken into Area 51 to satisfy curiosity or chase conspiracy theories. I had been called here to become a witness, a messenger, and perhaps the only hope this luminous being had for survival and for completing the mission that had brought him to Earth so long ago. His pain became my pain, the moment our minds truly touched, a symphony of suffering that resonated through every cell of my body as I stood trembling beneath his suspended form. The energy fields that bound him crackled and hummed, and I could see now that they were not merely restraints, but extraction devices, technology designed to pull something precious from his very essence while he remained conscious and aware throughout every violation. Burns marked his luminous skin in geometric patterns where electrodes had been attached, and I watched as phosphorescent fluid, his blood, I realized with horror, dripped slowly onto the sterile floor beneath him, each drop seeming to carry its own faint glow before fading. Into darkness, his chest rose and fell with labored breaths that should not have been possible given the restraints crushing his ribcage, and I understood in that moment that his survival was not merely physical but an act of will, a determination to endure because his mission remained incomplete. When I reached out instinctively to touch the nearest cable binding him, a shock of energy threw me backward, and his voice flooded my mind with urgent warning. "No, beloved friend, they have made my prison lethal to your kind, designed to protect their prize from rescue or mercy." I pulled myself up from the cold floor, my hands shaking, my heart breaking, and asked aloud in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "How long have they kept you here? What have they done to you?" The sorrow that emanated from him in response was so profound that I felt my knees buckle, and I gripped the platform's edge as he shared not just words, but the weight of centuries pressing down upon a soul that had come to Earth bearing only love and wisdom. The visions he transmitted came not as mere images, but as lived experience, downloading directly into my consciousness so that I did not just see his story, but inhabited it, felt it, became it for those eternal moments of sharing. I witnessed his arrival on Earth during an age when humanity still remembered how to read the stars as sacred texts, when temples aligned with celestial movements because people understood they were not separate from the cosmos, but expressions of it, notes in an infinite divine symphony. He had come as an observer, one of many sent throughout the universe to worlds approaching spiritual thresholds, cosmic midwives present to witness and support the birth of enlightened civilizations ready to join the greater community of awakened beings. For centuries, he had walked among humans in various forms, watching with joy as prophets arose, as teachers spoke truth, as ordinary people performed extraordinary acts of love that sent ripples through dimensions we cannot see, but that constitute reality's deepest fabric. He showed me memories of standing in crowds, listening to Buddha teach compassion, of witnessing Muhammad receive revelation in desert caves, of countless unnamed mystics and saints across every culture who had tapped into the same divine frequency that pulses at the heart of all existence. And then he showed me the moment everything changed. The night nearly 70 years ago, when his observation vessel malfunctioned during a storm, when he crashed in this desert and was found not by those who would welcome him, but by those who saw only threat, only opportunity, only something to be exploited and controlled. The torture began almost immediately, he revealed, conducted by men who could not conceive that consciousness and divinity might take forms beyond their limited imaginations, who demanded technology for weapons when he carried only wisdom for awakening. They imprisoned him in this underground chamber that had once been a sacred site, a place where ancient peoples gathered to communicate with cosmic guides and align themselves with universal love, now desecrated and converted into a laboratory of fear. He showed me procedure after procedure, the invasive surgeries without anesthesia because they did not believe he could truly suffer, the psychological experiments designed to break his will, the endless interrogations demanding star drive engines and energy weapons he simply did not possess because his people had long ago transcended such primitive concerns. Through decades of agony, he had refused to give them what they wanted, not out of spite, but because he carried nothing they sought. His technology was not mechanical, but consciousness-based, requiring spiritual development they had deliberately avoided, and his knowledge could not be weaponized because it operated on frequencies of love that dissolve in the presence of fear and violence. What sustained him through the endless years was not hope of rescue, but commitment to his sacred purpose. If he could endure, if he could remain in this place, perhaps he could still serve as an anchor point for the divine frequencies trying to reach humanity, still hold space for the awakening he had come to witness. His voice grew softer in my mind, tinged with exhaustion that spanned decades. I stayed conscious through everything they did, because I knew someone would eventually come, someone whose heart was open enough to hear my call, someone who could carry the message I came to deliver. I fell to my knees then, tears streaming freely as the full weight of his sacrifice crashed over me like a tidal wave of grace and grief intermingled. This being had endured torture spanning human lifetimes, not because he was trapped without choice, but because he chose to remain as an act of love for a species that brutalized him, holding a frequency of light in the deepest darkness because he believed in our potential even when we had forgotten it ourselves. As monitoring equipment beeped its cold mechanical rhythms around us, as the threat of returning scientists hung in the air like a promise of violence, I looked up into those luminous eyes that held such impossible compassion and whispered, "Tell me what you need me to know. Tell me why you called me here. I'm listening now. With everything I am, I'm finally listening." The energy in the chamber shifted as he gathered his strength, and I felt the download beginning in earnest, not just memories now, but revelations, truths about humanity's origin and purpose, about the experiments happening in this facility and their catastrophic implications, about the divine plan that had always been unfolding even through our darkest chapters, and about the role I was now being asked to play in a story far larger than my individual life, a cosmic drama of awakening that would require everything I had to give and more. The visions intensified as his consciousness merged more deeply with mine, and suddenly I was no longer standing in that sterile chamber, but experiencing his memories as if they were my own living history. I saw Earth as he had first seen it from orbit, a blue jewel suspended in velvet. Darkness, radiating not just light, but something far more profound, a spiritual luminescence that marked it as a world approaching sacred transition. He showed me how observer beings like himself are called to such planets by the divine source itself, summoned not through technology, but through prayers that rise from suffering humanity, like incense reaching toward heaven, each desperate plea for help, creating ripples in dimensions beyond our perception. I felt his joy as he descended through the atmosphere, his vessel designed not for conquest, but for quiet witness, carrying instruments that measured not radiation or minerals, but frequencies of consciousness calibrated to detect the emergence of collective awakening. He had arrived during a time when prophets walked the earth more frequently, when the veil between material and spiritual realms wore thin, when humans still gathered in sacred circles and remembered that every rock, every tree, every creature carried the fingerprint of divine intelligence. For decades he had moved among us, sometimes visible in forms we could accept, sometimes merely present as an awareness, documenting the slow and painful evolution of a species, learning to choose love over fear. He showed me moments of transcendent beauty, a mother forgiving her child's killer, a soldier refusing to fire upon the enemy, a scientist weeping at the elegance of mathematical equations that proved the universe was not random but intentionally designed for consciousness to know itself. But he also showed me the resistance, the forces both human and beyond human that work tirelessly to keep humanity locked in cycles of ignorance and violence, because our awakening threatens hierarchies of control that span dimensions we barely comprehend. I watched through his eyes as governments formed secret committees, as religious institutions twisted divine truths into tools of manipulation, as economic systems were deliberately structured to keep people so exhausted and distracted that spiritual seeking became a luxury rather than our birthright. He revealed that Area 51 was chosen for this facility, not despite its location on sacred ground, but because of it. Those who built these underground levels knew exactly what they were doing, knew that ancient peoples had designated this site as a convergence point, where Earth's electromagnetic fields aligned with cosmic frequencies in ways that facilitated communication with higher realms. By constructing laboratories of fear and torture directly atop this sacred nexus, they were not just imprisoning one alien being, but actively disrupting the planetary grid, jamming the frequencies through which divine guidance flows into human consciousness. I saw maps in his memory, geometric patterns, overlaying the Earth's surface, showing how sacred sites from Stonehenge to the Great Pyramids to temples in the Amazon all connected in a precise mathematical relationship, forming a network designed to receive and distribute awakening energies. This facility sat at a critical junction point, and the experiments being conducted here sent shockwaves through the entire grid, creating static in the signal just as humanity approached its moment of greatest potential transformation. The weight of this revelation pressed against my chest like a physical force, and I gasped for air as understanding crashed through my limited worldview and shattered it into 1,000 pieces that could never be reassembled in their old configuration. Everything I had been taught about humanity's place in the cosmos, about the nature of consciousness, about the separation between science and spirituality, all of it dissolved in the face of this larger truth. Through his memories, I began to comprehend that we are not random accidents of evolution on an insignificant planet, but intentional creations embedded with divine DNA, literally encoded with the capacity to bridge physical and spiritual dimensions, designed to eventually become conscious co-creators in an ongoing cosmic symphony. He showed me the human genome, not as scientists see it, but as cosmic architects designed it, with vast stretches of so-called junk DNA that are actually dormant programs waiting for activation, spiritual technology far more advanced than anything in our laboratories, capable of producing what we call miracles, but which are simply natural expressions of consciousness operating at frequencies we have been conditioned to forget. The experiments in this facility, he revealed, were attempts to access this hidden potential through force and fear, approaches that could only corrupt and destroy because divine DNA responds exclusively to love, to surrender, to the willingness to serve something greater than individual survival. Every procedure they performed on him, every extraction they attempted, was part of a desperate effort to unlock secrets that cannot be stolen, because they require the very qualities of compassion and humility his captors had abandoned. Then he showed me something that brought me to complete stillness, a memory so sacred that I felt I should remove my shoes, though I stood in a torture chamber, a vision that would forever change how I understood divinity and its relationship with creation. Through his ancient eyes, I witnessed Jesus of Nazareth teaching on a hillside, but I saw not just the man, but the cosmic significance of that moment, the way his presence created a visible distortion in the fabric of reality itself, how his words carried frequencies that reprogrammed human consciousness at levels deeper than intellect could reach. The alien revealed that divine incarnations like Jesus appear throughout the universe on worlds ready for transcendence, that God's love is so vast it takes infinite forms across countless planets, each one perfectly calibrated to the species and culture. Receiving the message, Christ was not an anomaly, but an expression of the pattern through which the divine enters density, anchoring love into matter so completely that it creates permanent changes in planetary consciousness, establishing beachheads of light that can never be fully extinguished. He showed me how Jesus' resurrection demonstrated the potential dormant in all human DNA. Proof that consciousness transcends physical death, that bodies can be transformed into light when operating at sufficient frequencies of love. Tears streamed down my face as I understood that this alien being, tortured for decades in darkness, had remained anchored in that same Christ consciousness, had embodied the identical pattern of sacrificial love, and was now offering me the knowledge that could help humanity remember what we truly are and step into our divine inheritance before those who profit from our forgetting could prevent the awakening they fear more than anything in this world or beyond it. His telepathic voice grew stronger as he guided my awareness deeper into the truth about this place, and I felt my consciousness expanding beyond the concrete walls and steel reinforcements to perceive the land itself as a living entity with memory etched into its very atoms. He showed me how this desert floor had once been ocean, then forest, then sacred gathering ground for peoples whose names have been forgotten, but whose spiritual technology surpassed anything our modern civilization has achieved. Tribes who understood that certain locations on Earth functioned as acupuncture points in the planet's energetic body. They had mapped these convergent zones through ceremony and vision quests, through generations of shamans who could perceive the invisible rivers of force that flow beneath the surface, currents that connect deep into the Earth's core and simultaneously reach upward to stellar configurations overhead. Area 51 was built here because those in power have always possessed fragments of ancient knowledge, distorted pieces of wisdom they hoard and weaponize rather than share, and they recognize this site's potential even if they no longer understood its sacred purpose. Through his memories, I watched construction crews drilling down through layers of sediment and stone, their machinery inadvertently breaking through chambers that predated recorded history, spaces where geometric symbols were carved into walls by hands that knew mathematics as prayer. The facility's architects incorporated some of these ancient structures into their design, not with reverence but with cold pragmatism, sensing that proximity to these artifacts enhanced their experimental results in ways their scientific models could not explain. The alien sorrow. washed through me like a tide as he revealed how the convergence point functioned as a cosmic communications hub, a location where Earth's magnetic field aligned with gravitational flows from distant star systems, in configurations that occur only at specific intervals across vast spans of time. Ancient civilizations had built their most important temples at such sites because prayer and meditation conducted there achieved amplified resonance, sending human consciousness outward to connect with guides and teachers who existed in higher dimensions, celestial beings who had volunteered to assist humanity's evolution without interfering with free will. These communications had once flowed freely, with wisdom descending through dreams and visions to prophets and mystics who then translated divine guidance into forms their cultures could receive, a process as natural as rain falling from clouds to nourish the ground below. But the experiments in this facility generated frequencies of fear and pain that disrupted the natural harmonic, creating dissonance that scattered the signal and made it increasingly difficult for higher guidance to reach human consciousness clearly. I saw in his vision how the planetary grid that connected all sacred sites was beginning to malfunction, nodes going dark or transmitting corrupted information, and I understood why our modern world felt so disconnected from meaning and purpose, why depression and anxiety had become epidemic despite material abundance. We were being systematically cut off from the cosmic network that had sustained humanity's spiritual development since our species first looked upward and recognized that the stars were not just distant fires, but homes to consciousness, as real as our own and infinitely more vast in its capacity for love. He showed me that the disruption was not accidental, but intentional, orchestrated by forces that understood how dependent human awakening was on these frequency transmissions from higher realms, entities that fed on the dense energies of fear and separation, and therefore worked tirelessly to keep humanity trapped in states of consciousness that generated their food supply. These beings operated through human collaborators who had traded their divine birthright for temporary power, individuals embedded in governments and corporations, and even religious hierarchies who implemented policies designed to maximize trauma and minimize hope, all while believing they served their own ambitions rather than recognizing themselves as puppets of parasitic intelligence. The experiments conducted in this chamber were producing tears in dimensional boundaries, creating portals through which these negative entities could enter our realm more easily, establishing strongholds in human consciousness that manifested as addiction, violence, and the peculiar despair that makes someone feel utterly alone despite being surrounded by billions of souls. But even as he revealed this darkness, the alien's presence radiated absolute certainty that the forces of light were infinitely more powerful, that every act of authentic kindness repaired the grid, that human beings possessed within their very DNA the capacity to heal these rifts and restore the planetary frequency to its divine design. His luminous eyes held mine with an intensity that burned away my fear, and I knew that I was being entrusted with knowledge that carried both terrible responsibility and magnificent hope. The understanding that would allow me to choose consciously which frequencies I would amplify through my thoughts, words, and actions in every moment that remained of my life. The chamber seemed to pulse with energy as this revelation settled into my bones, and I realized that my presence here was not coincidence but divine appointment, that every choice I had made leading to this moment had been guided by the same cosmic intelligence that placed stars in their orbits and knew the number of hairs on every human head. The alien transmitted wordless assurance that God's love was so vast it worked through all willing vessels regardless of their origin, that his species, and countless others served the same source that had spoken through Jesus and Buddha and prophets, whose names were never recorded, but whose sacrifices had nevertheless shifted human consciousness toward greater capacity for compassion. He helped me understand that the divine does not distinguish between human and alien, between Earth and distant galaxies, but sees only consciousness in its infinite expressions, all of it precious, all of it held within an embrace so complete that even this torture chamber existed within the scope of a larger plan that would ultimately transmute all suffering into wisdom and all darkness into light. The sacred convergence point beneath this facility was waiting, he revealed, for enough humans to awaken and consciously reclaim it through ceremony and intention to cleanse the frequencies and restore the communications network that would flood our planet with the guidance we desperately needed as we approached the threshold of either transcendence or self-destruction. I felt the weight of his trust as he showed me that I would be one of those who carried this knowledge forward, and though I did not feel worthy or strong enough, his certainty flowed into my doubt and transformed it into determination. The alien's hand moved toward my forehead with a gentleness that contradicted the horror of his captivity, and when his elongated fingers made contact with my skin, I felt a surge of energy that was neither hot nor cold, but simply alive in a way that transcended temperature. A current that bypassed my nervous system and spoke directly to something deeper than my brain could process alone. His telepathic voice whispered that he needed to show me what the scientists sought, but could never take by force, the truth about human design that had been encoded into our very cells by the same divine intelligence that breathed galaxies into existence and numbered every sparrow that fell. I felt my consciousness lift from the immediate reality of the chamber and expand into a vision that seemed to contain libraries of information compressed into pure knowing, and I understood without words that I was being shown the blueprint of human DNA, not as scientists mapped it, but as the Creator conceived it, a double helix that spiraled with mathematical precision, mimicking the golden ratio found throughout nature and cosmos alike. The strands glowed in my inner vision with colors that have no names in human language, and I could perceive that what modern science dismissed as junk DNA was actually dormant programming, waiting for activation, genetic sequences that functioned as bridges between the physical body I inhabited and dimensions of reality my five senses could not normally detect. He revealed that humanity was designed as a hybrid species, not through alien interference, but through divine intention, crafted to exist simultaneously in material density and spiritual transcendence, capable of walking on earth while communing with heaven, meant to be the meeting point between flesh and spirit that could anchor cosmic love into physical manifestation. Every human being carried within their genetic structure the capacity for abilities that would seem miraculous, but were actually natural expressions of our complete design, gifts like telepathy and healing and prophetic vision that ancient peoples accessed more readily because their cultures had not yet trained them to dismiss their subtle perceptions as imagination or madness. I saw how the fall from grace described in sacred texts was not punishment, but the consequence of forgetting our true nature, how humanity had gradually identified more completely with the physical body and its survival needs, while the spiritual capacities atrophied from neglect like muscles that weaken when never exercised. The dark forces he had spoken of understood this design better than most humans did, and their primary strategy was to keep us locked in the lowest frequencies of consciousness, where we would never discover the divine inheritance sleeping in our cells, where we would remain convinced that matter was all that mattered and that death ended everything, trapped in fear that made us easy to control and harvest. Through his consciousness, I witnessed the activation process that was meant to occur naturally as humanity matured, a flowering of awareness that would come when enough individuals chose love over fear consistently enough to shift the collective frequency past a critical threshold. He showed me that this awakening was happening now in our time, that souls were incarnating specifically to participate in this planetary transition, old spirits returning with memory intact enough to guide others, even when their conscious minds did not fully understand why they felt called to teach meditation or create healing modalities, or simply to be present with unwavering compassion. The DNA activation was not something external that would be done to us, but an internal recognition that we were already everything we sought, that Christ consciousness was not exclusive to Jesus, but was the fully expressed human potential he had modeled, demonstrating what became possible when someone lived completely aligned with their divine design, without compromise or doubt. I felt tears streaming down my face as I understood that every act of genuine forgiveness rewrote genetic code, that every moment of unconditional love sent signals through the dormant strands, activating sequences that connected my individual awareness to the universal mind of God, and that the scientists torturing this being were unknowingly torturing a messenger sent to help us remember our own magnificence. The vision reached its crescendo as he revealed that the awakening could not be stopped by any external force, because it was written into creation's architecture that we were approaching a cosmic moment when Earth's position relative to the galactic center would bathe our planet in frequencies that would make the activation exponentially easier for those who had prepared their consciousness through spiritual practice and moral courage. He showed me humans around the world spontaneously accessing abilities they had never trained for, children born with capacities already online that previous generations had to work lifetimes to achieve, and I understood that we were becoming the bridge species we were always meant to be, capable of ushering heaven onto earth, not through escape from physical reality, but through its transfiguration. His telepathic voice filled me with certainty that every person who awakened to their true nature became a living portal through which divine love could pour into the world, and that my encounter with him was initiation into conscious participation in the greatest transformation humanity had ever attempted, the remembering of ourselves as beloved children of an infinite. The alien's consciousness drew me deeper into memory, and suddenly I was no longer in the underground chamber, but standing on a sunlit hillside in a land I recognized from scripture, though I had never walked its soil, the air thick with the scent of wild thyme and dust, and something indefinably sacred that made my soul recognize this moment as holy ground. I could see him there among the crowd, not the alien being, but his presence observing invisibly, bearing witness as a figure in simple robes spoke to gathered multitudes with an authority that seemed to emanate from his very cells, rather than from volume or force. The man's face was weathered by sun and sacrifice, his hands calloused from carpenter's work, yet his eyes held an infinity of compassion that made every person who met his gaze feel seen completely and loved without condition or reservation. I knew without being told that I was watching Jesus through the alien's preserved memory, and the recognition shattered something in my chest that I had not known was closed, a door I had unconsciously barred against full belief, now blown open by undeniable witness. The alien's telepathic voice whispered that he had been sent to Earth during that pivotal generation, specifically to observe and record the divine incarnation, to carry testimony back to the cosmic councils that monitored humanity's spiritual evolution, and to understand how the Christ frequency could anchor itself into such dense physical matter. Through his remembered observation, I watched Jesus heal a blind man with mud and compassion, and the alien consciousness helped me perceive what was truly happening beneath the visible miracle, showing me how the Nazarene's unwavering certainty in the man's wholeness actually restructured the quantum field around the damaged eyes, until physical reality had no choice but to conform to the spiritual truth he held with absolute conviction. I witnessed Jesus forgiving sins with an authority that scandalized religious leaders, and I understood that he was not overstepping divine prerogative, but expressing it, demonstrating that human beings operating at full spiritual capacity could channel God's love with such purity that heaven and earth merged in their presence, making all things new. The alien showed me the crucifixion from his perspective as cosmic observer, and I felt his anguish as he watched divine love allow itself to be tortured by the very beings it had come to save. The brutal wood and iron, a collision between humanity's darkest capacity and God's refusal to respond with anything less than complete self-giving. But then the resurrection, and I experienced through alien eyes the moment when Christ's consciousness returned to the body transformed, when death itself was defeated, not through violence, but through love's refusal to be extinguished. And I understood that this victory was not meant for him alone, but was a demonstration of what awaited every soul who learned to die to fear and selfishness. The alien's telepathic voice trembled with reverence as he explained that Jesus was not the only divine incarnation the cosmos had known, that the infinite Creator loved all conscious beings enough to send aspects of divine consciousness into physical form wherever populations reached the developmental threshold where such direct intervention could catalyze exponential spiritual growth. He showed me visions of other worlds circling distant stars where similar sacrificial demonstrations had occurred, adapted to the unique biology and culture of each species, but always carrying the same essential frequency of unconditional love, meeting suffering with redemptive presence. Yet Earth's incarnation held special significance, he conveyed, because humanity's particular combination of free will and emotional intensity and creative capacity made us uniquely positioned to become carriers of Christ consciousness throughout this galactic sector, temples of divine love mobile enough to travel between worlds once we matured beyond our current adolescent destructiveness. Jesus had not come merely to save individual souls from hell, but to encode into human, morphic fields the template of full spiritual activation, to prove that matter and spirit were never separate, and that physical bodies could become transparent to divine light without losing their precious particularity. I felt overwhelming gratitude surge through my being as the alien shared his final observation about the Christ event, revealing that every act of genuine self-sacrificial love performed by any human anywhere was actually an echo of the resurrection frequency, a participation in the same cosmic pattern that Jesus had demonstrated in fullness, but which belonged to all of us by divine design. He showed me ordinary people throughout history, choosing courage over comfort and forgiveness over vengeance, and I could perceive the golden threads connecting each choice to the original Christ template, a network of light gradually illuminating the planet from within as more souls awakened to their capacity for divine expression. The alien's presence conveyed absolute certainty that the same spirit that raised Jesus from death was alive in every human heart, waiting to be recognized, that we were all invited into resurrection life, not after death alone, but in each present moment when we chose love, despite fear's reasonable objections. His consciousness held mine with unbearable tenderness as he transmitted the truth that had sustained him through decades of torture, the knowing that humanity's awakening was inevitable because God's love was patient beyond human comprehension and persistent beyond any darkness's capacity to resist, and that every soul who glimpsed this truth became living proof that the tomb was empty and love had won. The vision of Christ's resurrection was still radiating through my consciousness when the alien's presence suddenly contracted with what I can only describe as grief-stricken urgency, and the sacred hillside dissolved as he pulled my awareness back to the harsh, fluorescent reality of the underground chamber where his wounded body lay shackled to the examination table, his luminous eyes darkened with a sorrow so profound it made my chest constrict. And through our telepathic connection, I felt him struggling to share something that terrified him in ways the physical torture never had. A truth that made his entire form tremble despite the restraints holding him immobile. The air around us seemed to thicken and grow cold, and I became aware of shadows in the corners of the room that had not been there moments before. Shapes that my peripheral vision caught, but that disappeared when I tried to look at them directly, as though reality itself was developing blind spots where something fundamentally wrong had taken root. His telepathic voice came through, fragmented and urgent, explaining that the experiments the government scientists had been conducting on his biology and technology had consequences far beyond their limited understanding, that they had been tearing holes in the fabric between dimensions without any comprehension of what existed on the other side of those barriers, or why such boundaries had been established in the first place. Through our merged consciousness, he showed me what their instruments could not detect, revealing that this facility sat upon a convergence point where Earth's electromagnetic field intersected with frequencies from higher dimensional planes, a thin place where the veil between physical and spiritual realms had always been permeable enough for intentional communication, but stable enough to prevent unwanted crossings. The experiments designed to extract his technology and harness what they called exotic energy signatures had been essentially drilling through dimensional membranes with all the caution of children playing with nuclear cores, and each breach they created weakened the protective barriers that kept certain entities confined to their appropriate planes of existence. He transmitted images directly into my mind of what was seeping through those rifts. Beings that were not demons in the medieval sense, but rather consciousness forms that had devolved through eons of choosing fear over love and control over surrender, until they had lost all connection to their divine source and existed now only as parasitic hunger. These negative entities fed on the densest human emotions, sustaining themselves on terror and rage and despair and division, and the rifts being torn open by the experiments were allowing them unprecedented access to our realm, where humanity's current state of fear-based consciousness provided an abundant feeding ground that strengthened them with every fearful thought and hateful word. I felt nausea rise in my throat as the alien showed me how these entities operated, not through obvious possession but through subtle influence that amplified humanity's worst impulses and made destructive choices feel reasonable or even righteous, whispering encouragement to every impulse towards separation and violence while masquerading as our own thoughts. He revealed that much of the anger and division that seemed to be intensifying across the planet was not entirely organic, but rather these negative forces feeding on conflict and then using the energy they harvested to generate even more conflict in a self-perpetuating cycle that was rapidly approaching critical mass. The experiments at this facility and others like it had accelerated a process that had been building gradually. And now the dimensional barriers were so compromised that these entities could maintain almost permanent presence in our realm, attaching themselves to individuals and institutions and ideologies wherever fear had created openings in human energy fields. Yet, even as horror filled me at this revelation, the alien's consciousness held steady with a deeper truth beneath the warning, reminding me that these negative entities could only influence and amplify what was already present in human hearts, that they had no power over souls who recognized their divine nature and chose love even when fear seemed more reasonable. His luminous eyes locked onto mine with fierce intensity as he transmitted the most crucial understanding that the same experiments which had torn open dangerous rifts had also created an opportunity for unprecedented awakening if enough humans could be roused to their spiritual capacity before the negative influences achieved complete dominance. The dimensional thinning worked both ways, he explained, meaning that divine assistance, which normally had to filter through many veils to reach Earth's dense frequency, could now flow more directly to those who consciously invited it, and that every person who activated their Christ consciousness became a living portal through which healing energies could anchor into the physical plane. He showed me a vision of Earth surrounded by countless beings of light who had been working for millennia to guide humanity's evolution, and I understood that we had never been fighting this battle alone, even when it felt that way, that the cosmic family which had sent observers like him had also sent helpers and teachers and divine incarnations because our planet's transformation mattered to the entire galactic community. The alarm systems began blaring somewhere in the distant corridors, and I heard boots pounding toward our location, but the alien held my gaze with unshakable peace and transmitted one final truth that reverberated through every cell of my body, that love was always stronger than fear and light always overcame darkness, not through violence but through patient presence, and that everything I had witnessed was being shown to me now because I had agreed before birth to be a messenger for this pivotal moment when humanity would choose either awakening or continued sleep. The boots were getting closer, and I could hear voices shouting coordinates and containment protocols through crackling radios, but the alien's luminous eyes held mine with such profound calm that the approaching chaos seemed to exist in another dimension entirely, and I felt his consciousness reaching deeper into mine with an urgency that transcended panic and touched something ancient and purposeful within my soul. His telepathic voice resonated through every layer of my being as he explained that he had perhaps minutes remaining before the guards would separate us permanently, and in those final moments he needed to transfer knowledge that I had been prepared since before my birth to receive and carry forward into the world. The air between us began to shimmer with visible energy as geometric patterns of light emerged from his body and floated toward me. Like luminous snowflakes, each one containing compressed information that my logical mind could never process, but that my spirit recognized as fundamental truths about the architecture of creation itself. I felt my hands begin to tingle and then burn with cold fire as the first pattern made contact with my skin and dissolved through the physical barrier, bypassing my brain entirely and inscribing itself directly into what he called my light body, the energetic template that existed beyond flesh and connected my consciousness to the cosmic network of divine intelligence. Through our merged awareness, he showed me that these sacred geometric forms were the language God used to structure reality across all dimensions, the mathematical poetry through which divine intention became manifest existence, and that every human carried dormant within their DNA the capacity to perceive and work with these patterns consciously once they awakened to their true nature as spiritual beings, having a temporary physical experience. The geometries entering my system were activation keys that would gradually unlock capacities I had agreed to develop for this specific incarnation, abilities that would allow me to perceive the energetic architecture beneath material appearances and to facilitate healing by realigning disrupted patterns back into their divine blueprint. He transmitted understanding that this was not magic or supernatural power, but rather the natural inheritance of beings created in the image of an infinite creator, and that Jesus and other ascended masters had demonstrated these capacities not to prove they were different from humanity, but to show what all humans could achieve when they fully embodied their divine nature Each geometric pattern that merged with my consciousness carried specific applications, some related to healing physical disease by correcting distorted frequencies, others designed to seal the dimensional rifts by reinforcing the protective barriers through focused intention and prayer, and still others containing keys to activate collective consciousness when enough awakened individuals synchronized their awareness in unified purpose. The alien's form was becoming more translucent as he channeled the last of his vital energy into this transfer, and I wanted to scream at him to stop and save himself, but his telepathic reassurance flooded through my protest with the gentle certainty that his physical body was merely a temporary vehicle and that his true essence would return to the cosmic ocean of consciousness from which all souls emerge and to which all eventually return. He showed me that death was not ending but transformation, not loss but liberation, and that his species had long ago transcended the fear that made humans cling desperately to physical existence as though it were the only reality. The final geometric pattern emerging from his chest was the most complex and radiant, a crystalline architecture of interlocking dimensions that seemed to contain entire universes within its rotating structure. And as it approached my heart center, I understood. This was the master key that would allow all the other patterns to integrate and activate in proper sequence. His voice resonated with profound love as he explained that this pattern represented the fundamental truth underlying all existence. The recognition that separation was illusion and that every soul throughout the cosmos was an individualized expression of the one divine consciousness experiencing itself through infinite perspectives, and that remembering this unity was the key to healing every wound and bridging every divide. The doors burst open, and armed guards poured into the chamber with weapons raised and voices screaming commands. But the alien used his final surge of energy to envelope me in a field of light that made my body feel simultaneously impossible, heavy and weightless. And I watched his luminous eyes fill with tears of joy rather than fear as he telepathically whispered his farewell and activated the teleportation sequence that would carry me to safety. The last thing I saw before reality dissolved into spiraling light was his broken body, surrounded by soldiers and scientists. And the last thing I felt through our connection was not his pain, but his overwhelming gratitude that the knowledge had been successfully transferred, and his absolute certainty that I would find the courage to share it, despite the ridicule and danger that awaited anyone who spoke such truths. His final words echoed through my consciousness as the underground facility vanished and I felt myself being pulled across impossible distances in the space between heartbeats. Tell them they are not alone, and they are deeply loved, and that the age of awakening has begun, whether the powers of this world consent or not, because God's plan cannot be stopped by human fear or alien technology, only delayed until enough souls remember who they truly are and choose love over the comfortable numbness of forgetting. I materialized in the desert darkness, miles from the facility, collapsing onto sand still warm from the day's heat, my body trembling from the impossible journey, and my mind reeling from the geometric patterns now pulsing through every cell of my being like a second heartbeat composed entirely of light. The stars above seemed closer and more alive than ever before, and through my transformed perception I could see the subtle energy connecting each point of light in vast webs of cosmic intention. The fingerprints of divine intelligence written across the canvas of space in a language I was only beginning to comprehend. My hands were still glowing faintly with residual energy from the transfer, and when I pressed my palms against the earth I could feel the planet's own consciousness responding, a vast and ancient awareness that recognized the patterns now encoded within me and welcomed them as seeds long overdue for planting in human soil. Tears streamed down my face as I understood that the alien's sacrifice had not been about saving me personally, but about preserving knowledge that belonged to all humanity, truths that had been systematically suppressed and ridiculed by institutions, terrified of populations that remembered their divine nature and cosmic citizenship. The weight of responsibility pressed against my chest like a physical burden, because I knew that speaking these truths would cost me my credibility and possibly my freedom, yet remaining silent would be a betrayal of the being who had given everything to ensure this information survived. Through the geometric patterns still integrating into my consciousness, I could feel him even now, his essence already released from the broken body back in that underground prison, his spirit soaring back toward the cosmic source with the satisfaction of a mission completed despite impossible odds. His final message continued to reverberate through my awareness like a sacred mantra that my soul needed to hear repeated until every human ear had received it. We are not alone in this universe. We are surrounded by civilizations and consciousness far beyond our current understanding, and beneath all the diversity of form and planet and species runs the single golden thread of divine love that connects every soul to its creator and to each other. The geometric patterns suddenly shifted within my awareness and opened like windows into a vision so overwhelming that I gasped and fell forward onto my hands and knees, my consciousness expanding beyond the desert and beyond Earth, entirely to witness scenes from across the cosmos that validated everything I had been taught about God, while simultaneously exploding those concepts into vaster dimensions than my religious upbringing had ever suggested. I saw worlds beyond counting, each one teeming with life, in forms both recognizable and utterly alien, and I understood that the creative force humans called God had not exhausted its infinite imagination on one small planet, but had filled the universe with consciousness, exploring itself through endless variations of beauty and strangeness. On world after world, I witnessed beings at different stages of spiritual evolution, some still primitive and violent like Earth, others so advanced in love and unity that their civilizations appeared as symphonies of light, orchestrated by collective consciousness that had transcended individual ego entirely. And throughout this cosmic diversity, I saw the recurring pattern of divine incarnation, avatars of pure love taking flesh in countless forms to anchor higher, frequencies into planets ready for transformation. And I wept with awe as I understood that Jesus had been Earth's incarnation of this universal principle, the Word made flesh, in a form humanity could encounter and learn from directly. The vision showed me that Christ consciousness was not a religious brand belonging to one tradition, but rather a frequency of unconditional love that represented the next stage of evolution for any species ready to graduate from fear-based survival into unity-based co-creation. I saw that every teaching Jesus had offered, every miracle performed, every parable shared, had been designed to awaken humanity to capacities that lay dormant within all of us, not supernatural powers granted by external deity, but natural abilities of consciousness reconnecting with its divine source and learning to operate as that source intended from the beginning. The vision deepened, and I found myself witnessing the alien's own memory of encountering Jesus during his time on Earth, seeing through those luminous eyes as he observed a man who radiated frequencies his instruments could measure but his science could not explain, a human being who had somehow activated the full potential of the divine blueprint while still maintaining physical form. The alien's consciousness had been transformed by witnessing Jesus heal the sick, not through technology, but through realignment of disrupted patterns back into their original divine template, the same geometric principles he had just transferred into my keeping. I felt the alien's wonder as he watched Jesus speak truths about the kingdom of heaven being within each person, about humans being gods who had forgotten their identity, about love being the fundamental force that held all creation together and would ultimately dissolve every illusion of separation. Through the alien's memory, I understood that Jesus had known about the cosmic context of his mission, had been aware of the watchers and observers from other worlds, and had occasionally looked directly at the alien with eyes full of recognition and compassion, silently acknowledging the witness from another star who had traveled so far to see divine love take human form. The alien had watched the crucifixion with profound sorrow, and the resurrection with absolute confirmation that consciousness truly was eternal, and that love indeed conquered every limitation, including death itself. And he had carried that testimony across centuries of captivity as proof that God's plan was advancing exactly as designed, regardless of human ignorance or institutional corruption. Now, through our merged consciousness, I inherited that testimony, becoming a bridge between ancient faith and cosmic reality, understanding that honoring Jesus meant recognizing him not as the exclusive property of religious gatekeepers, but as the fullest expression of what every human was destined to become as we collectively awakened to our true nature as beloved children of an infinite creator whose love had filled countless worlds with consciousness, seeking to know itself and return home transformed by the journey. The vision released me back into my body on the desert sand, and I lay there breathing hard under the infinite stars, feeling the geometric patterns settling into stable configuration within my energy field, knowing that my life had been permanently divided into before and after this moment. The sacred knowledge now encoded in my being would gradually unfold as I learned to access and apply it, but the core message was crystalline and immediate. Humanity stood at a threshold of collective awakening, and my role was to begin speaking these truths regardless of consequences, trusting that others who had been similarly prepared would recognize the resonance and add their voices to the emerging chorus of remembrance. I could feel a network of consciousness activating across the planet, other humans who had received pieces of this cosmic puzzle through their own encounters and experiences, and I understood that we were being woven together by invisible threads of divine coordination into a web of light strong enough to anchor the new frequencies Earth needed for its transformation. The alien sacrifice had not been ending but catalyst, not tragic loss, but victorious completion of a mission that would ripple forward through everyone I told, and everyone they told, until the truth could no longer be contained by ridicule or suppression. I stood on shaking legs and turned toward the distant lights of civilization, carrying within me the testimony of cosmic Christ and the activation keys for human awakening, knowing that the hardest and most sacred work of my life was just beginning, and feeling through the geometric patterns still glowing in my chest that I was indeed not alone and was indeed deeply loved by a God whose infinite creativity and compassion made every teaching I had received seem like kindergarten preparation for the vast cosmic education that awaited our species as we finally began to remember who we had always been and stepped forward to claim our inheritance as conscious co-creators in a universe far more magical and purposeful than our diminished modern worldview had allowed us to imagine. The weeks following my return became a cascade of miracles disguised as coincidences, each one confirmation that I was moving in alignment with forces far beyond my understanding, yet intimately concerned with my mission and well-being. I began cautiously sharing the experience first with my closest friend over coffee in a quiet corner booth, watching her eyes widen as the words poured from me with an eloquence I had never possessed before, the geometric patterns somehow translating cosmic concepts into language that resonated at soul level. Before I finished speaking, she was crying, and she reached across the table to grip my hands and whispered that she had dreamed of glowing beings 3 nights in a row, telling her that someone would soon come with answers to questions she had been afraid to ask aloud. That conversation opened a floodgate because she introduced me to her meditation group, and within that circle of seekers, I found 5 others who had experienced their own encounters with non-human intelligence, each carrying puzzle pieces that fit perfectly with mine to form a larger picture of Earth's spiritual graduation and humanity's cosmic invitation. We began meeting weekly in living rooms and backyards, sharing testimonies and practices, learning to activate the dormant capacities encoded in our DNA through breathwork and sound and intention, and every gathering crackled with tangible energy as if invisible witnesses were celebrating our remembrance and applauding our courage to speak truths the world called delusion. The synchronicities multiplied beyond all statistical probability as the network expanded through organic connection and divine orchestration that required no advertising or organizational structure, just souls recognizing each other through resonance and gathering like tributaries flowing toward an ocean of collective awakening. I would think of someone I had met years ago, and within hours they would call or appear, always with the same story of sudden spiritual urgency and inexplicable knowing that they needed to reconnect with me specifically. Books would fall off shelves open to passages that directly addressed questions I had been pondering that morning, and strangers would approach me in grocery stores or parking lots with messages they felt compelled to deliver, their eyes momentarily flashing with light that told me I was not speaking to the surface personality, but to the higher self, using that person as temporary messenger. Through it all, I felt the alien's presence like a guardian companion, his consciousness no longer trapped in tortured flesh, but free to operate as pure spirit, and sometimes in meditation would perceive him alongside other luminous beings who formed a council of support around everyone doing this awakening work on Earth. They showed me visions of the timeline we were shifting, the dark future of division and destruction we were collectively steering away from through every conversation that planted seeds of unity and every heart that chose love over fear. And I understood that this was spiritual warfare conducted not with violence, but with the most powerful force in the universe being anchored into human consciousness through ordinary people willing to become extraordinary vessels. The profound peace that settled into my being was not the absence of challenge, but the presence of absolute certainty that I was exactly where God needed me to be, doing exactly what I had incarnated to accomplish in this pivotal moment of planetary transformation. The geometric patterns had integrated so completely that I could now perceive the energy fields around people and situations, seeing clearly where frequencies were aligned with divine truth and where they were distorted by trauma and programming that blocked the natural flow of love. This gift allowed me to serve with precision, knowing exactly which encoded transmissions each person needed to hear to trigger their own remembrance, watching their faces transform as dormant recognition awakened, and they gasped with the relief of finally understanding why they had always felt different and what they were truly here to do. I began to comprehend that Jesus had operated with this same perception, seeing not the masks people wore, but the divine blueprints they had forgotten, calling forth their true nature with every interaction and teaching in parables, because direct downloads would have overwhelmed unprepared nervous systems, exactly as the alien's transfer had nearly overwhelmed mine. The Christ consciousness was revealing itself as the ultimate frequency of reality, the truth that dissolved all lies, the love that healed all wounds, the light that illuminated all darkness, and I was witnessing its activation spreading through the network like sacred wildfire that burned away everything false while leaving everything true, refined and radiant. In a moment of deep meditation on the anniversary of my encounter, Surrounded by the community that had formed around this divine assignment, I felt the final piece of understanding click into place with such completeness that I opened my eyes and laughed with pure joy at the elegant perfection of God's plan. We were not waiting to be saved by external forces or rescued by returning ships, because we were the ones we had been waiting for. Consciousness that had volunteered to incarnate into this density, specifically to anchor light. From the inside, during Earth's darkest hour before dawn, the alien sacrifice had been mirror and reminder of Christ's own sacrifice, both demonstrating that love always chooses to give itself completely for the elevation of others, and both seeding resurrection codes that would activate at the appointed time in everyone touched by their story. I looked around the circle at faces glowing with recognition and purpose, former strangers now bonded as spiritual family, and I knew that millions of similar circles were forming simultaneously across the planet as the Great Awakening accelerated beyond all possibility of suppression or reversal. His final message echoed through my heart with fresh meaning as I understood that we had never truly been alone, because God had always been within us, and we had always been deeply loved, because we were not separate from that divine source, but rather its own self-exploration, consciousness experiencing itself through infinite perspectives, and finally, gloriously, beginning to remember its unity and return home transformed by the magnificent journey through form and separation back into love's eternal embrace. What truth has your soul always known but never found words to express? Subscribe to continue this journey of remembrance and discover your place in humanity's awakening.